Homesteaders, Gardeners, and Cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about ways that you can tweak canning recipes. So if you're new to canning, you kind of get a sense pretty quickly, especially if you're looking at things online, that there's two general groups of canners. There are the safety police canners who will absolutely ream you out because you changed something by a teaspoon. And there are the cowboy canners who think that they can pretty much do whatever they want and it's going to be safe. I lean more towards the canning police side of things. I tend to want safe, tested recipes, but I'm also just one of these people that is absolutely always wanting to know the why behind things. So if somebody says, do X, I want to know why you need to do X and not Y. And if I don't have a good explanation for why you do X, I find it incredibly frustrating. And so I have done some deep dives into canning and food safety. I also have a small commercial kitchen above my garage. And so I've looked into it a little bit more from that point of view because I'm actually selling some product. And then I've taught some canning classes as well. And so I fall into the category of let's do it safely, let's use tested recipes, but also let's be practical and realistic. And if there are things that we can tweak that really don't matter one way or the other, let's do that. I just recently was watching a YouTube video from a homesteader that I like and enjoy, and they were looking for a pickled pepper recipe that was specifically for banana peppers. And they couldn't find a banana pepper pickled recipe in any of their Ball canning books. And so they got on the National Center for Home Food Preservation site, and they did find a recipe for pickled banana peppers on that site. And what she didn't know with all of that is one of the tricks and tips that I have here for you is that any pepper you can substitute with any other pepper in a recipe. So in a pickling recipe or in a salsa recipe, as long as you keep the volume the same, you can change out any pepper. They are interchangeable. And so that was a great example of she didn't know, and I'm sure she's done pickled peppers before, but she didn't know that the peppers were interchangeable. And so she could have taken any pickled pepper recipe that she already had and just substituted those banana peppers into that recipe, and it would have been completely fine and it would have been completely safe. So I'm here to talk to you about that kind of stuff. So here are the general rules, and this is the kind of stuff that I also talk about when I do my intro canning classes. So what makes a recipe safe in canning is a bunch of different things. One of them is acidity. So if you're a water bath canning, the acidity needs to be below a certain point. I believe it's 4.6. And generally the canning authorities actually like it to be even lower than that. I'll put a little diagram up here on the screen that shows some pH of some fruits and vegetables. One of the reasons that you're able to can fruit and do jams and jellies and things like that in a water bath canner is fruit is naturally quite acidic. And so that's part of what is preserving the food. However, it isn't just about acidity. It's also about, and I have notes here just so that I don't forget and miss something, it's also about how dense the food is. That's really important. And so sometimes you'll find a recipe for something like butternut squash. This is a pressure canning recipe, but butternut squash, it needs to be in chunks. You can't puree butternut squash and can it. There isn't a tested recipe for that. And that is because the density of the food matters. And so having all that liquid around those chunks of butternut squash allows the heat to penetrate into the center of that butternut squash chunk. Versus, weirdly, you wouldn't expect this, but when it's pureed, it acts in a different way and the heat acts in a different way, and that isn't a tested recipe. So if it calls for something being in chunks rather than pureed, that's important to pay attention to. An example of this, a friend who is actually one of the people who has written the master canning and preserving classes that the extension offices put on. And when I met her at a conference, once I found out what she did for a living, I looked at her and I said, I have questions. Because there were certain things in canning books that had driven me crazy for years that I just didn't understand why they were the way they were. And so for the next couple of months, I would just shoot her like one question a week about some random thing that came up in canning that I always wanted to understand the answer to. One of those was, why is the processing time so different with canning tomatoes versus when you're canning tomatoes in water versus you're canning tomatoes in their own juice? It's a pretty dramatic change in the amount of processing time. I'll look it up and put it on the screen here. I think one is like 45 minutes and the other is like well over an hour. And I said, I don't understand. Why is this so different? And she said because when you're canning them in their own juice, the juice is more dense than water. And so it takes longer for that heat to fully penetrate. And I was like, oh, of course, that makes perfect sense. But they never explained that. And so density is another factor that comes into this. As I said, the shape and size of the pieces of food matter. Water activity, and this is something that I've talked about in some of my other videos. I'll put a definition up here on the screen. Basically, water molecules, free-floating water molecules, are part of what allows mold and things like that to occur. And there are certain things where if you add enough sugar to the process, that sugar hangs onto those water molecules very tightly. And so it's basically unavailable to the mold that might form. And so water activity is something that you see talked about, particularly in jams. And so that can be important as well. So basically, is there something in there that's binding the water to itself tightly enough that it is not available to cause problems with possible mold spores? The rate of heat penetration, and this is definitely why I use tested recipes and don't just wing it, because I don't have a little special data logger that fits in the center of that jar and records the temperature over time as it slowly rises, slowly rises, slowly rises, and then holds at a certain point where I know for a particular botulism spore or for a particular mold spore or whatever it is in there that I'm worried about, how long does it take at a certain temperature in order to be killed? That's definitely kind of a 201, 301 level canning that is not something that's usually available to a home canner. We're kind of at the 101 level. So heat penetration is really important, and it's not something that we just can intuitively guess at. It's something that you really need to have somebody have done the testing. And sometimes you can be really frustrated with recipes where it seems obvious. One of my favorite versions of this is salsa, and why can't you find recipes that use citric acid in salsa instead of vinegar in salsa? And it's not that that isn't something that's possibly safe, it's just that nobody has tested it. And it's because these agencies that do this kind of testing, their budgets have been slashed. That's true of extension as well. The amount of money going to extension offices is drastically reduced from what it was probably 50 years ago. Their budgets have been slashed, their staff have been slashed, and they simply just don't have the money to test it. And so the attitude is kind of like, we've done, 100 years of research and testing. There's all this stuff out here. Make do with what you've got. Don't ask us to do anything more, because it can be, probably ridiculously $50,000, $100,000 to do a test on a new recipe because of everything that goes into it and all the bureaucracy and infrastructure and equipment and yada, yada, yada that goes into that kind of stuff. So it's hard to find things that are newly tested. It is one of the benefits of having something like the Ball Canning Company out there, because they're a big corporation and sometimes they can afford to do testing when our National Center for Home Food Preservation can't. And so that's part of why they're a secondary tested source. And then lastly is size of jar. And so how long heat takes to penetrate and all of these other factors is going to be affected by the size of the jar. This is a little 8-ounce jar versus, a giant quart jar. There's going to be a lot more volume in here. It's going to take a lot longer for something like this to heat up to the proper temperature than something like this. One of the rules of canning is that you can always reduce the size of the jar for the recipe. So say you're making salsa, maybe you don't want it in pints, maybe you want just a little 8-ounce servings, half pints, because you're going to give it as gifts or because you want something that you're going to open, eat at one sitting and be done with. You can always reduce the size of the jar for the recipe and just process it for the time of the jar size that was the next size up. So I could put salsa in these. You never see salsa recipes that are 8-ounce jars, but I could put salsa in these and then process it for the pint time, and that would be completely safe. You, however, cannot go the other way. So you can't decide, oh, this recipe only gives me the time in pints and I want to process it in quarts. I'm just going to, do a little bit of this and guess at how much longer that processing time should be in quarts. That is not a safe option. So you can always reduce the size, but you can't increase the size. You will notice that there are half-gallon ball jars out there. The only things that are tested in half-gallon ball jars tend to be juices. So clear juices where there's no chunks of anything in there, there's no density issues. So apple juice, grape juice, things like that. I personally just use them for storage. I do sometimes also use them for apple juice, but I love the half-gallon jars for storage. I have an obscene number of them and I keep a lot of dry goods in them, but I don't tend to can in them. Okay, so down to some of the nitty gritty here. I've kind of rambled all over the place. The type of acid that you use in a recipe, usually if it's a vinegar, they're calling for 5% vinegar. Just recently, because of all of the supply chain issues and inflation and stuff, there's a lot of different vinegars out there that are no longer at 5%. They're at 4% instead. They're diluting them, they're adding more water and charging the same price, because that makes them look like they're still the same price when in reality they're 1/5 less vinegar in the container. So really look at the side of the jug of vinegar that you're buying. Make sure it says 5%. There's a lot out there now that are 4%, including some well-known brands that you wouldn't necessarily think would be 4%. So double check that for sure. In order of acidity, apple cider vinegar is the least acidic. White distilled vinegar is more acidic. Lime juice is even more acidic than that. And then lemon juice is very similar to lime juice. And so you could actually, if something had a small amount of vinegar in it, if you wanted to use lemon juice instead, you could, because you are increasing the acidity by using lemon juice or lime juice instead of vinegar, because lemon juice and lime juice are more acidic. However, if the recipe specifies lemon juice or lime juice, you cannot go the other way. It's just like the jar size. You can't substitute a vinegar for lemon juice or lime juice because they are not the same acidity, and that's going to change your results. There is a lot of debate about whether or not you should always use bottled lemon and lime juice. Bottled lemon and lime juices are standardized to a certain acidity, and so the general rule of thumb has been whenever the recipe calls for lemon or lime juice, they mean bottled lemon or lime juice. However, there's some pretty good evidence that the fresh squeezed lemon or lime juice is actually more acidic than the stuff in the bottle, almost always. Like, I don't think there's been a proven incidence where lemon and lime juice that's fresh is less acidic than what is coming out of a bottle, which makes sense because just like the vinegars, they're going to dilute that lemon and lime juice down to a standard so that they can get more water and less actual lemon or lime juice in the bottle and get away with it, versus when you squeeze it out of a fresh piece of fruit, it's going to be more concentrated. So those are the rules around that. Really important, sugar and salt. If there are sugar and salt in a recipe, let's take a pickled anything recipe, but particularly like pickled peppers. A lot of times they'll call for a little bit of sugar, a little bit of salt, a little bit of both. That's in there for flavoring. It's not actually in there for preservation. What's doing the preservation is the vinegar. The exception to this is if you're fermenting. So if you're doing any kind of fermenting, which actually I consider a completely different thing and I don't consider it canning, that the salt is absolutely critical, and please do your recipes by weight and not by volume if you want consistent results. I have a recipe on fermenting sauerkraut if you want to get started on your fermenting journey. And then I also have a fermented hot sauce recipe. And that, in that case, the weight and the amount of salt is absolutely critical to the safety of the product. But with canning recipes, it's in there for flavor. It is not in there for preservation. If you're on a diet that's a low salt diet, you can leave it out. If you are on a no sugar or low sugar diet, you can reduce it or leave it out. It may change how that product holds over time, particularly with sugar in fruit products. The sugar acts a little bit as an antioxidant. And so if you just can peaches in water and not in a sugar syrup, they're going to discolor and probably not hold their texture as well as they would have if you'd used a sugar syrup. But that was another question that I was super confused about when I first started canning, because it would say use a light syrup, and then I'd go to that page for making up the syrup and it would have extra light, light, medium, heavy. And it was like, well, why do I have all these options? Why are you giving me all these options if it's calling to do A, why do I have A, B, C, and D listed here? And can I do a different one? And it took me years to finally get the answer of you could actually just do it in water with most fruit, because most fruit is acidic enough that it doesn't matter. So sugar and salt generally just there for flavoring. You can increase it, you can decrease it. And if you're making something like jam, you can't just arbitrarily decide to decrease the amount of sugar in the recipe, because it actually is part of the whole chemical reaction with the pectin and with the acid and yada yada. And so it's very hard to reduce sugar in jams and jellies without using a low sugar or no sugar pectin and get something that's actually going to gel, because it's actually part of that chemical reaction. But for simple recipes like, pickles and salsas and things like that, if you want to leave it out, leave it out. If you taste it and you think this needs a little bit more salt, add a little bit more. It's okay. It's not going to change the safety of the recipe at all. When it comes to seasonings, Generally, the rule of thumb is to use dried seasonings rather than fresh seasonings. Fresh seasonings have a lot of water in them, and that can help dilute the overall recipe and change your pH. Dried seasonings, it's really just there for flavoring. My general rule of thumb for this is if a recipe calls for, a total of a tablespoon of dried seasonings, I feel like I have a tablespoon to work with. And so maybe I don't like dill and something calls for dill, which is actually true for the most part. So I'm gonna substitute parsley, or I'm gonna substitute a mix of parsley and rosemary, or parsley and thyme, or parsley and oregano, or whatever. You can interchange and mix and match spices and dried herbs in recipes, or just leave them out altogether. In fact, my cowboy canning recipe, the original recipe called for mustard seed, it called for celery seed, and those are the kind of spices that you would use in a relish, not the kind of spices that I wanted in a candied jalapeno. And so I simply left them out because I didn't like that option. I thought that was a bad option. So you can leave spices out, or you can substitute them with something that you do like. My general rule of thumb is don't increase them. And so if it calls for a total of a tablespoon of different herbs and spices, you've got that much wiggle room to play with, but don't go adding, it calls for a tablespoon, I'm gonna add a quarter cup. That's probably not a good idea because you potentially are gonna be changing the pH. As I mentioned, peppers are interchangeable in a recipe, and that is also true of onions. Keep the volume the same, and that can be tricky with peppers. The recipe calls for a bell pepper, and you're now gonna use jalapenos. You're really gonna need to measure that because jalapenos are, the recipe calls for 3 bell peppers. I end up often Googling, how many cups is 1 bell pepper chopped? I'll chop that many jalapenos instead. So you need to keep the volume the same, and sometimes if they're just specifying the vegetable and not specifying the volume, you might need to do a little Googling or a little, experimentation in your own kitchen to figure out what the equivalency is there. But peppers are interchangeable, and also true of onions. So if it calls for white onions, you can use red onions, you can use yellow onions, doesn't matter. All of those are interchangeable. And as I mentioned, size of jar, you can go down, but you can't go up. So those are my general rules of thumb in terms of really great tips and tricks for how to tweak recipes slightly without having to worry that there isn't a specific tested recipe for the specific thing that you want to do. You can change out the spices, you can change out the salt and sugar, and you can change out the vinegars. Vinegar types are interchangeable as long as they are the same acidity. So, apple cider vinegar, white vinegar, red wine vinegar, white wine vinegar, as long as they're 5%, all of those are interchangeable. Note that rice wine vinegar is often less acidic than those other vinegars, and so pay attention to that. It's important. Other updates about canning that people often miss, I think it was 2005 or maybe 2015, they standardized all recipes to be a minimum of 10 minutes of processing time for water bath canning. The reason they did that is because 10 minutes of processing time will kill mold spores. And so if you have an old jam or jelly recipe and it only calls for 5 minutes of processing time, increase that by 5 minutes, because the benefit of that is you don't have to sterilize your jars. It used to be this whole process where you'd fill up your whole canner, bring it to a boil, put all your jars in the boiling water, boil it for a certain period of time. It was a minimum of 5 minutes. I can't remember how long it was, probably 10. And then, pull out and dump out all that boiling water out of your hot jars, set them on the counter. There was this whole rigmarole in order to sterilize everything. None of that is required anymore, you guys. It is a huge game changer. You don't have to soak your canning lids either. You used to have a small, little thing, and don't bring it to a boil, because if you bring it to the boil, it might actually melt the compound and make it not work when you put it on the jar. But keep it at just a simmer of hot water, and keep your canning jars in there in order to loosen up that compound so that you could use it. They have changed the formula so that is no longer true. You can put canning lids directly onto your jars and put those rings on, as long as you wipe the rims. Don't forget to do that, and put them in the canner. You don't have to wash them first. You don't have to soak them first in hot water. Yeah, so those are big things that when I teach canning classes, people often come to the canning classes as a refresher, and their heads explode when they find out that they don't actually have to sterilize their jars before they use them. Things that you shouldn't ever do, and this is just directly from a list that was compiled by the Healthy Canning website. Highly recommend their website. They've got some really great information, and a lot of this I learned from taking deep dives into some of their pages. So you don't ever shorten a processing time from what it was called for. Even if you're changing the size of the jar, just stick with what's already been tested. Don't change the processing method. And this can be frustrating. Like sometimes canning tomatoes, it's sometimes 75 minutes or more in order to can a tomato. And that's a long, long time on the stove. And I keep thinking, can't I just pressure can this? Because it's not going to matter to me. But there's no tested recipe for pressure canning the particular recipe that I want to use, because I feel like pressure canning would be faster, because usually they're less processing time. So use the method that's called for. And sometimes if you do some digging, they'll have several options. I know tomatoes, there's some pressure canning options out there as well. But don't change the method. And for heaven's sakes, don't ever take a pressure canning recipe and change it to a water bath canning recipe. Yes, I know the Amish do this and they're mostly okay, but we also have no idea how many Amish people get sick and have issues with some of the ways that they can things, because most likely, you know, they're kind of an insular community and they're taking care of each other. And my guess is a lot of times we never hear about that stuff because it's never reported. So yeah, I know they do some things that are definitely a little off the beaten path. And you know, maybe those things actually do work and they've just simply never been tested by a national authority. But for me, it is not worth that gray area in order to water bath canned green beans or some ungodly thing like that. Don't switch out the types of foods in a recipe. And so you can change out peppers for peppers, you can change out onions for onions, but don't decide, I don't want onions in this recipe, I'm just gonna put twice as many peppers in there. That is not okay. Each one of these ingredients has been looked at in terms of the pH range, and there's a lot of wiggle room in those recipes because things can vary based on, you know, how they're grown and how they're, the type of soil and the type of climate and, you know, different weather conditions. And so they assume that there's a range there, and that's all been taken into consideration. You cannot substitute one vegetable for another in a recipe canning and assume it's going to be okay. I do make a little bit of an exception for this. Is I will Google the pH range of a particular vegetable, and if I want to make a substitution and the thing I want to substitute is always more acidic than the thing that I am taking out, my personal rule is I'm going to substitute one for the other. However, that does not take into consideration density. And so I'm definitely walking on a little bit of shaky ground by doing that, but you do what makes you feel safe in your own kitchen. That's one of those things where I feel like there's enough wiggle room in terms of other aspects that I'm aware of in order to substitute those kind of things. Thickeners, the only thickener that's usually allowed in recipes is something called, I want to say clear gel, something called clear gel. So if you're doing pie fillings, they call for clear gel. You cannot substitute cornstarch. You cannot substitute other thickeners like tapioca or that kind of thing. Again, it's a density issue. Those change the density of the product, and they were never tested with that. And so you have to stick to the thickener that is on the tested recipe. Don't get creative with that. There are no tested recipes for dairy, and so there are people out there that are canning butter, that are canning milk, that are canning cream. And yes, I know that sometimes you can find those shelf-stable products. Obviously we have condensed milk and we have evaporated milk on our store shelves. That's a company that had a whole lot of money and a whole lot of food scientists behind it that did a ton of testing, and they also have equipment that we don't have access to in our home kitchen. Please don't can milk. I think that's a line where if I really wanted to preserve something like that desperately, that's when I would really start looking at something like a freeze dryer rather than canning. I just saw somebody who had canned a whole bunch of butter in order to clean it out of their freezer, and I thought, oh man, like one, there's no tested recipe for canned butter, and two, even assuming it was safe, butter goes rancid when it sits at room temperature. And you know, I've had butter just sitting in my butter dish get funky over the course of a month. I can't imagine what a jar that's sitting on a shelf would taste like after a year, because butter is oils and oils go rancid with time. And so yeah, just don't go there. That also is true. I've had rants about this in other videos. Don't dry can potatoes. Don't dry can beans, where you start with dried beans and add water and put it in a pressure canner. Please don't do that. I'm not going to go into any more detail than that, but just please don't do it. Yeah. So there's some updates, some tweaks. The big change for updates on like rules for home canning in the United States, I believe, was 2005. And so if you have an old ball book, if you have a bunch of grandma's old recipes that you're using, that kind of thing, the best thing you can do is just do some digging and make some notes on those old recipes and figure out how to bring them up into the current modern age. You know, you can always take the attitude that people always say when you question those kind of recipes, which is, my grandma's been making this for 50 years and nobody's died. And nobody's died. That's great, but maybe this is the time when something goes a little bit sideways. And again, sometimes recipes are safe, they've just never been tested. But my lines on the road are, I'm going to work with tested recipes, and I'm going to work with the tweaks that I know are safe within those lines on the road, rather than just wing it. I have an old recipe for pickles from my stepmom, and actually it came from one of my aunts, so one of my dad's sisters, for pickles. Very popular recipe with the family. It has a lot of salt in it. It was made with rock salt, of all things, so like the kind of salt that you would get for getting ice off of roads, but also for making things like old-fashioned ice cream. So it called for rock salt, which is very unusual. And then it's mostly salt and water and only a little bit of vinegar. Generally, rule of thumb is a recipe needs to be 50% vinegar in order for it to safely pickle something. Anything less than that, and it's usually not okay. And so, yeah, I grew up on this. I never was a big pickle eater, so I didn't eat a lot of these pickles, but I grew up on them. They were around. My stepmom made them every year. That is not a recipe that I consider safe, and it is not a recipe that I would personally use. But I do know that 50% vinegar recipes for pickles are generally considered safe. And so when I've modernized that recipe and made it, I actually had some rock salt from an old ice cream maker, and so I weighed out the amount of rock salt that it called for, got a weight on that, and then used pickling and canning salt instead that was the equivalent weight. And then I upped the vinegar to 50% in order to modernize that recipe and make it safe in the current age. So there are ways, if you have a little bit of food science knowledge, to update things. And sometimes if you've got a really good local extension agent, they will help you with that kind of stuff. They're very gun shy about that because a lot of times they're worried about getting sued. They're worried about, not telling you the right thing and somebody getting sick. But there are extension offices and extension agents out there who are really comfortable with this kind of thing and feel like they have a very strong grasp of the food science, who will help you take a recipe that's an old recipe that's beloved by the family and figure out how to modernize that. And sometimes it's just changing the processing times, but they'll help you figure out how to modernize that so that it's safe in the modern age. So what about you guys? Are you the kind of person that has the, hey, my grandma made it this way forever and nobody died, and so it's totally okay if I keep doing this? Or are you the kind of person that when somebody gives you a gift of canned preserves, you look at it with a little bit of a side eye because you're not sure how they processed it and you don't know if it's safe or not? I tend to fall into the secondary category, I must admit. I'm pretty cautious about this stuff. But thanks for listening. I appreciate all of you guys are out there, and the channel is slowly growing over time, and it's been really exciting to see everybody get excited about home canning projects this summer, and some of my older videos are coming back up, and I'm seeing new comments on things that I've done last year or the year before. I do have quite a few preserving videos, and so there's a playlist for preservation. You guys can look through that if you're looking for ideas, and I've got some good preservation projects coming up over the next couple of months in terms of recipes that you guys haven't seen yet. So thanks so much for watching. I really, really appreciate you, and we'll see you next time, tribe.